Mirasee.
You can get a lot of results from small podcasts. You actually don't need really big audiences to move the needle in terms of leads and in sales. This is a really good SEO strategy. Even if you're on 50 podcasts and they all have 5 listeners each, now you have 50 backlinks to your website because all of these podcasts put a link to your website on their show notes page.
In a crowded world where standing out can feel nearly impossible, especially for coaches, how do you make your voice heard without blending into the noise? Today, we're exploring a powerful strategy that goes beyond just spreading your message. It's podcast guesting. I'm Melinda Cohan, and you're listening to Just Between Coaches. I run a business called the Coaches Console, and we're proud to have helped tens of thousands of coaches create profitable and thriving businesses. This is a podcast where we answer burning questions that newer coaches would love to ask a more experienced coach. So, how can podcast guesting become a powerful tool for generating warm, qualified leads and creating an intentional journey for your audience? And why is podcasting more of a networking strategy than just a broadcasting tool? Join us as we uncover the secrets to leveraging podcast guesting as a coach and discover how this dynamic strategy can transform your business. I've invited Jessica Rhodes to the show today for this exciting conversation. She's the founder of Interview Connections, the world's first and leading podcast booking agency. Interview Connections was awarded the 2022 Bronze Stevie Award for Marketing Agency of the Year and Podcast Booking Agency of the Year by Corporate Vision magazine. With over 30,000 podcast interviews booked for her clients, Jessica knows a thing or two about transforming guest appearances into impactful business strategies. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am excited to have you on the show. Before we dive into the topic, would you mind sharing a little bit of background with our listeners?
Absolutely. I got into the world of online business 11 years ago in 2013 because I wanted to be a stay at home mom. When I was pregnant with my first child, I was working at a nonprofit organization leading a door to door field canvas. And I called up my parents and I was like, I want to change careers. I don't want to be doing the nonprofit door to door work anymore. And my dad, who is a business coach, so he's been a business coach for over 20 years and has a newsletter marketing company, he said, you should start a virtual assistant business. You can work from home, you have your own business, you set your own hours. I'll be your first client. That's what got me started in the world of online business. So I was his virtual assistant. And one of the things he asked me to do was to book him as a guest on podcasts because it was a really effective way for him to speak to his target audience and get coaching clients without having to do that in person, one to one networking. That is, yes, it's effective, but it's not scalable at all. It takes a lot of time. It's typically very expensive when you are traveling around to different events, whether they're local or you're getting on a plane and staying away for nights at a time. So, yeah, my dad asked me to book him on podcasts, and I absolutely fell in love with it.
Oh, that's awesome. I know we have found several great guests that have been on this podcast through your service. So we thought, let's invite her here. Let's invite her to talk about what she does and how to make the best of it. So you started Interview Connections back in 2013. Was it the booking of your dad? Is that how you morphed from being a VA into what you're doing now? Is that the birth of Interview Connections?
That's right. Yeah, I was booking my dad on podcasts. He referred a couple of his friends to me. So then I got a couple other clients that were VA virtual assistant clients. I was doing some social media marketing, client support work, and podcast interview bookings. And around May of 2013, I'm a few months into doing the VA type of work. I'm talking with my dad. We're going for a walk, and I'm like, I really want to be able to make more money, but not just bill more hours because I had a baby at home too. It's either you have to work more hours or raise your prices by the hour to make more money. And he coached me and asked me some questions, and we landed on niching down into the podcast bookings because nobody else was offering this as a service. And podcasts were really picking up speed. There were a couple 100,000 podcasts in the world in 2013. Now there's over 3 million. So we saw that there was a wave starting to build, and I just got my surfboard and hopped on and launched Interview Connections. Fall of 2013 is when the website went live.
Awesome. So what steps should someone take if they want to appear on podcasts? What are some of the steps they should take to lay a strong foundation to get ready for that strategy?
Yeah. Number one, commit to the strategy. This is not a get rich quick overnight silver bullet fix to a broken business. So, this is a strategy that can be a slow burn. It's long term and it's effective when you have that long term vision. So, number one, manage your expectations. That's going to be super important. Number two, set clear goals. What do you want to get out of the strategy? For me, it's overall brand awareness and visibility. I know that every single time I'm on a podcast, whether the show has 50 listeners or 5,000, that's people that now have spent 30 minutes with me, whether it's 15 or 60 minutes. That's a lot of people. Given it took me maybe 30 minutes to record the episode, that's a very scalable way to grow. Some people will be like, oh, that was cool, but not for me. Some people will say they're going to write my name on a note in their phone and come back to me when they're ready. Other people will reach out and become a client the next week. All three are possible. Having that goal of brand awareness and visibility and managing your expectations is super important. Once you know what your goal is for podcast guesting, you can decide what are the right types of podcasts to be a guest on to meet that goal. What do I need to be interviewed about on those podcasts to capture the attention of my ideal clients who are listening? And then what should my call to action be? What should I invite those listeners to do? What should I invite them to get from me for free in order to maximize as many potential leads and prospects as possible? Those are really the first few steps that you should take if you want to be on podcasts.
I love it. Let's talk about that managing expectations one for a second. What would be a healthy expectation? Is it to spend, 3 months on this strategy? Is it a thing we've got to give it at least a year? What are some healthy expectations?
I say give it at least a year.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do this for less than a year. Some people say, could I try this out for 60 days, 90 days? Podcasts are pre recorded. So let's say you do give it 90 days and you get on podcasts over the course of 3 months. At the end of that 90-day period, most of those interviews aren't even live. They're not published yet. They're still being edited. They're still in the queue to be released. And even if a lot of them are live, it takes time for the listeners to download, to listen, to then take action. So you want to give it at least a year. It also takes time to really hone your message and become an effective podcast guest, to really optimize your funnel so that when people do find you, they go to your website, they are effectively converting, booking calls with you, and your emails are, nurturing them effectively. There's so many variables and factors that impact, is this marketing strategy producing these sales? So give it at least a year, but ultimately 3 plus, because speaking to targeted audiences will never go out of style. Businesses need to be doing that all the time. So, but I'm biased because I run a podcast booking agency and this is my favorite marketing strategy.
Yeah, when we were starting Just Between Coaches, I feel like it was about 6 to 9 months of consistently doing interviews and hosting people that we worked out the processes, the kinks. It was a decent amount of time before we found our rhythm, but we're finding that stride. And it kind of feels like a hockey stick growth, but it's like we're building the foundation and then all of a sudden we start seeing things are starting to increase with how many listeners we have, download, all that kind of stuff. So it's really important. I love that you said a year at minimum, 3 plus ideal. So thank you for the truth in setting those expectations.
Yeah, I love the hockey stick analogy. That's true for one of my clients, Dr. Jolie Hamilton. She's been with us since 2020. It's 2024 now. And her first year, there was no direct financial ROI. But a few months into her second year, literally hockey stick growth from less than a 6 figure business to 80,000 plus months. Sometimes you really just need to plant seeds, water those seeds, and all of a sudden they all come to fruition.
Yeah. Now let's talk about that tangible business growth, the monetizing part of this strategy. Like you said earlier, it's about great brand awareness. It's about getting visibility, and that's really all it can be. And then there's others who are like, no, you must monetize this, and it can be a revenue stream in your business. So, what's the secret sauce to turning a podcast appearance? If you're going to be a guest on somebody's podcast, how do you turn that episode you did with them or the multiple appearances that you have, how does that help you get an ROI?
Yeah. So this is really honing in on the goal of lead generation. When somebody says, my goal is to generate leads and to get clients, then we really need to focus on what we talked about already. Go on the correct podcast. Make sure the podcasts you're guesting on are speaking to audiences that have your ideal potential clients. Make sure the topics you're being interviewed about are ideal for them. You need to be sharing stories, giving case studies and examples so that the listeners can see that you have a track record of success, can see that you're working with people that they can identify with. All of these are factors that are going to contribute to an emotional buying decision. All buying decisions end up being emotional at one point or another. Even if someone says they're a logical buyer, it's always some type of emotion that gets people into the buying decision. So sharing stories and then giving an effective call to action. A lot of podcast guests make the mistake of giving multiple calls to action. They give multiple social media platforms where people can find them. They give their website, they give a lead magnet, they give multiple lead magnets. Give people one place to go. There should be one invitation for them to take that gets them into basically your sales funnel. What is that intentional journey that someone is taking towards ultimately becoming your client? For a lot of coaches, that's some type of call. It's a discovery session, it's a breakthrough call. It's an opportunity for the listener to be on the phone with you or a member of your team, an opportunity for them to have a conversation where they could get some coaching for free that probably ends in some type of invitation for them to work with you. And at the end of the day, I love sales. I've been in sales my whole life, including this business and my previous career. You've got to talk to people if you want to close sales. So, yes, you can get people onto your email list, but that is going to prolong reaching your goal to close sales. The more sales calls you're having, the more people you're talking to on the phone who are potential clients, the more sales you're going to close.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you painted the whole picture because a lot of coaches that I talk to, they mistakenly think, oh, I'll go be on this podcast. And when I'm on the podcast, I'll tell about my program and I'll sell my program right from the podcast. I've never experienced that to be the case. I love that you painted the picture that it's you providing value, case studies, stories, examples of what's possible, giving some tips and insights. And then the call to action is the beginning of your sales funnel. So you have to have that built before you start podcasting, or else you're going to generate great awareness, but you may not monetize it.
Yes. The only time that I've experienced a host and a show that really is selling my program is if the host is a client. So if you are on a podcast and that host is your client, there's going to be a lot of promotion of your service or your program because you're both in on it. Or if the host is an affiliate. So I was on a podcast, the host of the podcast, he's known me for 10 years. He's an affiliate, a referral partner. So he was really promoting our service because he'll get a commission if anyone from his audience buys. And that was fully disclosed with the audience. So those are two scenarios where you may see a lot more promotion. But 90% of the time, no, you are not directly selling. You're meeting these listeners for the very first time. You're probably meeting that host for the first time. So invite them to take an action that moves them closer to the point where you can make an invitation to buy.
Now, you mentioned something earlier that I want to pull out. You talked about when you're preparing to be a guest, you identify the kinds of questions you've got the right kind of podcast, and then you've got what are the interview questions that you want asked during that. In the early days when I was a guest on podcast, I always had here's a Google Doc, here's some interview questions. The host would always say, are there specific questions you want me to ask on topic XYZ? And I'm like, here's some questions. Sometimes they would ask them, sometimes they wouldn't, sometimes it'd be a mix. Here at Just Between Coaches, our producer meets with the guest or does her own research. And based on that discovery call that we have, she then drafts the prompts and the questions that might be asked. Is it important to know in advance, have a list of questions? Is that a necessary part of the preparation when it comes to podcast guesting?
What you just described is perfect. As the guest, have suggested questions that are ideal for you, that would set you up for success. Provide that to the host or their producer, and then be willing to go with the flow. I always like to say, you can ask me anything. Like, here are some suggestions, but I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to speak to your audience. Be open to going with the flow, because the interview will be much better if and when the host is truly interested in the questions they're asking and not just reading from a script. And ideally, the questions you suggest are also the questions that they're interested in. And so it's a win-win. I was on a podcast where I provided questions around guesting, but they wanted to talk about being a host, which isn't my main topic. So it was really like, oh, okay, we're going to go this direction. All right. You just have to think on your feet and be down for the ride. You can't be like, excuse me, host. That's not what I want to talk about.
I'm not answering that question. Now, speaking of questions, this was an area when I first started at the very beginning, I didn't know how to create questions. And so I was like, I don't know, just whatever questions you want to ask, I'm sure it's going to be perfect. And
Yeah.
they're like, okay. And I would make them just figure it out. How do you, like, you work with clients being guests, how do you help them figure out what questions they should share with the host? Do you have any tips? Because this is one of those things I wish I knew.
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the things that we love helping our clients with, because it does almost feel natural in the beginning. Like, it almost feels like that makes their job easier, but that actually makes the host job a little bit harder, because they're like, I don't know what to ask you. So, as the guest who's doing this strategy intentionally, some of the tips that I give to create questions are: look at your clients. Number one, what pain points are you helping your clients solve? So that's number one. What pain points are you helping them to solve? What are the root causes of the pain that you're helping them to solve? You just want to write all this out, because it'll illuminate, oh, I could craft a question that has me talking about that. What are some stories that you would want to share to highlight your story and showcase your track record and experience? What are some questions you could be asked to prompt you to tell that story? Look at the objections that you get from clients who don't sign up. If they knew something that would overcome that objection, what would that be? For example, one of my topics and questions is around how this is a networking strategy, not just a broadcasting strategy. That tees me up to do a lot of education in my podcast appearances and in my content around the value of the relationship with the host, which is a huge way that our clients see an ROI. Is the host invites them to do a second appearance, becomes their client, becomes a referral partner. Sometimes, if we have a client that doesn't sign up, they say, I want really big audiences because it's a numbers game. I need to make sure my ideal clients know this is not a numbers game. It's about the right target audiences. So, seeing the objections that I get, I'm like, if I did content on this, if they heard this interview, they would not have that objection in the sales call. List out all the objections you get from people and think, what could I teach them before the call that would make that objection go away? And those are just a few tips on how to write out your questions. But if you journal out all the answers, you will have some really good questions for your podcast one sheet that will make your interviews super effective in converting not just leads, but dream clients.
Yeah, I love that. This is where I would get my stomach in knots. I'd get all sweaty. I'm like, oh God, I don't know what questions. I did the trial by error where after several podcast appearances, I was like, oh, that person, I liked answering that one. That was helpful. And I would just grab some of the questions, but knowing how to craft it is so helpful. Thank you for that insight and those tips. And, you talked about it being a networking strategy, and it is so true. I just came out with my recent book, The Professional Coach, and I reached out to a lot of my podcast guests to say, hey, could you help me get the word out about my new book? And one of them that you introduced us to be on this podcast sent me over 1,000 coaches that got their hand on my book when we gave it away for free. It truly can be a great networking strategy to reach people you otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. So first of all, thank you so much for that. But it really is a networking strategy. Is there anything else that our listeners should know about using it as a networking strategy?
Well, I love that story, by the way. Like, that is such a good example of one person that resulted in 1,000 people, like 1 to 1,000. That's incredible. That story perfectly exemplifies what networking and podcasting looks like. It is the guest and the host collaborating. How can you provide more value to one another? It's unlikely that unless you have a podcast, you're going to get all these people to come on and spend an hour with you one on one. People want to be in a scalable conversation, but once you are one on one, there's so much more to talk about. There's so much more that you can do. Networking is very effective. Business owners need to be networking, but podcast interviews make the networking much more scalable because you have all these flies on the wall that are listening to the conversation. And then there's the green room chat. So, Melinda, like, let's talk offline. We're going to chit chat in the green room. And I would like to find out who that person was and hear more about the story that may not be appropriate to share with all of the listeners publicly. That's the power of the networking. You do this great interview, but then there's stuff in the interview where you say, oh, let's talk more about that after the interview. And you can go deeper with the host and with your guests. So much can come out of those relationships.
Yeah, that's a tip I want to throw in for our listeners. The conversations are juicy when we're actually doing the episode, but it's the before in the green room and the after that. I mean, I have had guests that have hired me and said, hey, can you help with X in our business? So I've gone to be a consultant for them. I'm leaving in a month for a speaking gig that I got because of the green room chat. And it doesn't have to be long conversations. And so a tip I would throw out is make sure you build cushion. When you are a guest on a podcast, don't be like, I've got an appointment from 9 to 10. The episode is from 10 to 11, and I've got another appointment at 11. Like, build in cushion because that magic is real. And that's where a lot of the networking can happen as well.
I love the green room chat so much. When you're on a podcast, I do 3 to 4 podcasts every single month. Some hosts, there's an energy match. You have a good rapport with them and you go deep. Another host, great person, maybe it just wasn't a love connection. Not every relationship with the host is going to result in some amazing collaboration. That's why you want to be doing multiple interviews every single month, because one host connection that leads in 1,000 book sales, like,
Yeah.
that's worth the whole entire year of podcasting, you know? Like, those are the types of results that make the entire thing worth it. And that's just another tip that I want to give. Don't micromanage your results. A lot of people make the mistake of looking at each individual podcast appearances. Did this one get me an ROI? Did I get enough leads from this one? It's not like that. Some shows are going to get you all the clients that are worth a year of podcasting, but there's no way you could have known which is the one podcast that was going to get you all the clients.
Now, speaking of the shows and the episodes, when somebody has been a guest and they've got their episode, what are some of the effective ways that they can leverage that content to really begin to maximize their visibility online?
Yeah. So repurposing your content as a podcast guest is one of my most favorite ways to monetize the strategy. No, not monetize in terms of like get leads and clients, but having thought leadership content to promote across your marketing platform is incredibly important and effective at nurturing your existing audience. There's a few different AI tools out there where you can input the podcast appearance, the video version, and it'll create clips for social media that you can upload. I'm not going to drop any names, but if you Google AI short form video clip, I'm sure you'll find them out there. These are super cost effective ways to create clips that you can put as Instagram reels, videos on LinkedIn, TikToks, whatever floats your boat. Get that short form content out there. My client, Christina Woods, is an empowerment coach, and she got a client. Somebody just watched the short form clip. They watched a clip of her on a podcast, and that was enough for them to say, "You're for me." So definitely use these clips. People don't have to hear the entire episode sometimes to know that you're the coach for them. I love using podcast appearances in my sales follow ups. When I confirm a call with a potential client who's booked a sales call, I give them a link to a podcast appearance that I did. And I'm like, hey, I'm going to learn about you before the call. It'd be great if you could learn about me and Interview Connections. Here's a podcast appearance that I did. A lot of my leads come to that call, like, thanks for sending that podcast. I listened. And we can go so much deeper in the sales call than somebody coming cold, not knowing who I am at all. And then one more tip. So I just started adding my podcast appearances to my website as blog posts. An alternative way, a lot of coaches may want to do a press page, because as a coach, you may have more of a personal brand where it makes sense to have a whole press page, your bio and everything. Because we're an agency, I don't necessarily want a Jessica Rhodes press page, but I do want to promote the podcast appearances that I'm doing about guesting. So it's great for your SEO. It's great to add content to your website and to help promote the episode. When you promote your podcast appearances, that episode's going to get more downloads. So don't just rely on the host to promote the episode. You should also be promoting the episode to your audience.
I love those tips. I mean, you've booked thousands of podcast interviews. What is an unconventional or counterintuitive insight when it comes to being a guest that even some seasoned entrepreneurs might be surprised to learn?
I would say that you can get a lot of results from small podcasts. You actually don't need really big audiences to move the needle in terms of leads and in sales. This is a really good SEO strategy. Even if you're on 50 podcasts and they all have 5 listeners each, now you have 50 backlinks to your website because all of these podcasts put a link to your website on their show notes page. You now have a much bigger footprint online. You give an immediate positive first impression to people that Google you because they're seeing that you're on all these podcasts. So that is just something I always love to highlight because a lot of people go into podcast guesting thinking, I just need to be on the biggest shows possible. It's a numbers game. I need a lot of listeners. Like, if I'm going to look good, I need to be on really big shows. But if you just commit to consistency and people Google you, that immediately gives a positive first impression, which will help your business grow over time.
Now, speaking of that consistency and growing your message, is it important for guests to tailor their message to the different audiences that they're in front of? Or do they just have the same message or same set of questions? What are some tips about how to handle that?
Yeah, I like to tailor it a little bit. On this podcast, Just Between Coaches, you'll notice, my example, I am referring to, as a coach, you have a personal brand. So I do little things to tailor it. I wouldn't overthink it and think, oh, I need drastically different questions and examples for different podcasts. If I'm on a podcast speaking to real estate investors, I'm going to just kind of swap out coach for real estate investor because really the topic and what I'm teaching is similar from business to business, but it's more effective and the listeners will resonate with your episode more when they just feel like it's tailored. A little bit of tailoring to who that target audience is will go a long way in having the listener feel more of an emotional connection to you.
And lastly, for coaches that are just starting out, because we've got a lot of listeners that are at the very beginning of their business, what's one piece of advice that you'd give them about leveraging podcast guesting effectively?
Just start and be consistent with it. A lot of new coaches will put it off. Oh, my website's not nice enough yet, or I don't have enough followers on Instagram. Like there's a million reasons why they think they're not ready for it. My first time being a guest on a podcast before my interviewconnections.com website was live. I did not have a great online presence. I didn't really have a social media following, but the host was interested in my story of being a new mom and starting my business. They didn't really care about my online presence. Over time, your website's going to get better. You're going to grow your following, branding will improve. Just get out there, speak. You will get better over time.
Yeah, beautiful. So I just want to summarize some of the things that we've talked about today. I love all the tips and all the different ways you shared with our listeners. It's not just a broadcasting tool. Yes, it does build visibility, brand awareness, but it's also a networking tool, maybe more so a networking tool. And I can very much relate to that. I love when you gave us the secret sauce about how to monetize it. I see this mistake with guests that come on our show. At the end of your guest appearance, give a call to action. Do not give multiple links. Find me here and here and here and here and here. One, what's the one place you want people to go? I love the clarity of that. I love how you taught us how to create questions, and you just gave us so many tips on how to leverage the content of the episode beyond what the host does with it and all the things that you can do with it. I thank you for all of the really nuts and bolts details that you got into. Jessica, do you have any parting words?
I think my final words of wisdom is really to just start. There are many different ways to get yourself booked. You can just go start Googling, just start finding podcasts that are a good fit for you and reach out to the host. You can hire someone to do it. There's a lot of different ways to get booked, but just start. You're ready. You have a story, start sharing it, start playing the game. That's how you're going to get better.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Just Between Coaches, and also a big thank you to Jessica Rhodes for this incredible conversation. You can find out more about her at interviewconnections.com. That's interviewconnections.com. In the show notes, you'll find the link to her website and her own podcast, Monetize the Mic. Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Melinda Cohan, and you've been listening to Just Between Coaches. Just Between Coaches is part of the Mirasee FM podcast network, which also includes such shows as Neuroscience of Coaching and Making It. For more great episodes of Just Between Coaches, follow us on Mirasee FM's YouTube channel or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed the show and want to help spread the word, please leave us a 5-star review and tell your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.